Most people throw away the one part of a bell pepper that could feed their family for years. They slice the top off, scoop out the seeds, toss them straight into the trash, and never once think about what they just wasted. But there was a time in America when those tiny seeds were treated like gold. There was a time when a single bell pepper, grown in a cracked pot on a back porch, was the difference between eating and going hungry. And the strangest part of this story is not that people figured out how to grow infinite peppers from one plant. The strangest part is that almost everyone forgot how to do it. Until now. It was the summer of 1932, and the United States was deep in the grip of the Great Depression. Factories had closed. Banks had failed. Millions of men and women who had once worked steady jobs now stood in bread lines that stretched around city blocks. Families who had never known hunger before were suddenly learning what it meant to go a full day without a real meal. In the cities, people dug through garbage cans looking for scraps. In the countryside, farmers who had once fed the nation were watching their own crops rot because they could not afford to harvest them. It was a time of heartbreak and confusion, and nobody seemed to have any answers. But in small towns and quiet neighborhoods across the country, something interesting was happening. People were turning to the soil, not because they had read about gardening in some fancy magazine, not because it was trendy or popular. They did it because they had no other choice. They did it because the ground beneath their feet was the only thing left that had not been taken from them. In a small wooden house on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, a woman named Dorothy Mae Collins stood on her back porch one evening and looked out at a patch of dirt that had not been touched in years. She was 34 years old. She had 3 children. Her husband, James, had lost his job at the steel mill 6 months earlier, and the family had been surviving on cornmeal, water, and whatever kindness the neighbors could spare. Dorothy was not a farmer. She had grown up in the city. She had never planted a single seed in her entire life. But she had heard something from an old woman at church the Sunday before, and it had stuck in her mind like a splinter she could not pull out. The old woman's name was Hattie. She was in her 70s, and she had survived more hard times than most people could imagine. After the service, while the other women were talking about how bad things had gotten, Hattie had pulled Dorothy aside and said something simple. She said that a bell pepper plant, if you treated it right, would keep giving you peppers over and over again. She said you did not need to buy new seeds every season. She said you did not even need a garden. A pot, some dirt, and a little bit of sunlight were enough. And she said that during the last hard times she had lived through, that one trick had kept her family fed when nothing else could. Dorothy had listened carefully. She had gone home that night and thought about it. And the next morning, she walked to the kitchen, picked up the one bell pepper she had left in the house, and instead of cutting it up for dinner, she did something different. She sliced it open gently, scooped out every single seed, and laid them on a piece of cloth by the window to dry. She did not know if it would work. She did not have any gardening tools. She did not have fertilizer or special soil. All she had was a rusty tin bucket with a hole in the bottom, some dirt from the yard, and a stubborn refusal to let her children go hungry one more day. 3 days later, she pushed those dried seeds into the dirt inside that bucket, set it on the back porch where the morning sun hit strongest, and poured a little water over the top. Then she waited. The first week, nothing happened. The second week, nothing happened. Dorothy started to wonder if Hattie had just been telling stories. She almost gave up. She almost dumped the bucket out and used the dirt to fill a hole in the yard. But on the 10th day, she saw something that made her heart jump. A tiny green shoot, no bigger than a fingernail, was pushing its way up through the soil. It was so small and so fragile that a strong wind could have killed it. But it was alive. And Dorothy felt something she had not felt in months. She felt hope. She watered that little plant every single day. She talked to it. She moved the bucket around the porch to follow the sunlight. She shooed away insects with her bare hands. And slowly, week by week, that little shoot grew into a strong green plant with wide leaves and a thick stem. By the end of the second month, she could see the first tiny white flowers forming on the branches. And she knew, from what Hattie had told her, that those flowers meant peppers were on the way. The first pepper appeared in late August. It was small and green and slightly lopsided, but to Dorothy, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She picked it carefully, brought it inside, and sliced it into thin strips. She mixed it with a little cornmeal and fried it in a pan with a tiny bit of lard. That night, her 3 children ate something with real flavor for the first time in weeks. Her youngest daughter, who was only 5, looked up at her with wide eyes and said it was the best thing she had ever tasted. But Dorothy did not stop there. She remembered what Hattie had told her. She saved the seeds from that first pepper. She dried them just like she had dried the ones before, and she planted them in 2 more containers she had found behind the house. One was an old coffee can. The other was a wooden crate lined with newspaper. Within weeks, she had 3 pepper plants growing on her back porch, and each one of those plants would go on to produce dozens of peppers before the season was over. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. Dorothy did not keep her secret to herself. She told her neighbors. She gave away seeds. She showed other women how to dry them and plant them and care for the young plants. And before long, back porches and front stoops all along her street were lined with tin cans and buckets and boxes, all of them holding pepper plants that were growing strong and green in the Alabama sun. What Dorothy had stumbled into was not just a gardening trick. It was a survival strategy that Americans had been using for generations, one that had been passed down quietly from grandmother to granddaughter, from neighbor to neighbor, from one hard time to the next. And it was about to change her life in ways she never expected. By the fall of 1932, Dorothy Mae Collins had more bell peppers than she knew what to do with. Her 3 plants had turned into 7, and each one was producing fruit like it had something to prove. Green peppers, mostly, but some of them were starting to turn red and yellow as they ripened longer on the vine. She had never seen anything like it. A woman who had never touched soil before that summer was now feeding her family from a collection of rusty cans and broken crates on her back porch. But the peppers did more than fill her family's stomachs. They changed the way her entire neighborhood thought about food. Before Dorothy started growing, most of the families on her street had been completely dependent on bread lines and charity handouts. They waited for hours in the heat for a loaf of bread and a tin of beans. They accepted whatever was given to them and tried not to complain. But when they saw what Dorothy was doing with nothing more than seeds and dirt and sunlight, something shifted inside them. They realized they did not have to wait for someone else to feed them. They could feed themselves. A man named Robert Turner, who lived 4 houses down from Dorothy, was one of the first to follow her example. Robert was a proud man who had worked in construction his whole adult life. Losing his job had nearly broken him. He spent most of his days sitting on his front steps, staring at the street, feeling useless. His wife, Elma, had tried everything to lift his spirits, but nothing worked. Then one afternoon, Alma came home with a handful of pepper seeds that Dorothy had given her after church. She handed them to Robert and told him to do something with them. Robert did not want to. He said gardening was not real work. He said it was foolish to think a few seeds in a can could make any difference. But Alma was not a woman who took no for an answer. She set the seeds on the kitchen table and told him those seeds were going in the ground one way or another, and he could either plant them himself or watch her do it. Robert planted them the next morning. Something happened to Robert Turner over the following weeks. As he watched those first green shoots push up through the soil, he felt something he had not felt since the mill closed. He felt useful. He felt like he was building something. Every morning he checked on his plants before he did anything else. He experimented with different amounts of water. He moved the containers to catch the best light. He even started talking to his neighbors about what was working and what was not. Within a month, Robert had 6 healthy pepper plants growing in his side yard, and he had become the unofficial gardening expert of the block. This was happening all over America during the early 1930s. They called them relief gardens, or subsistence gardens, or sometimes just survival gardens. The government eventually caught on and started promoting the idea. But the truth is that ordinary people had figured it out long before any politician gave a speech about it. Families in Detroit, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in small towns across the South and Midwest were turning every available patch of dirt into a food source. Empty lots became community gardens. Rooftops became growing spaces. And bell peppers became one of the most popular crops because they were easy to grow, produced a large harvest, and the seeds could be saved and replanted season after season without ever spending a cent. The science behind it was simple, even though most of the people growing peppers at the time did not think of it as science. A single bell pepper contains between 100 and 300 seeds. Each of those seeds, if properly dried and planted, can grow into a new plant. And each new plant can produce between 5 and 15 peppers in a single growing season, depending on conditions. That means one pepper, in theory, can lead to hundreds or even thousands of peppers within just 2 or 3 growing cycles. It was not truly infinite, of course, but to a family that had been surviving on bread and water, it felt like a miracle. Dorothy learned more about the process as the months went on. She learned that the seeds needed to be fully dry before planting, or they would rot in the soil. She learned that the plants liked warm weather and did not do well in cold or frost. She learned that the soil needed to be loose and well drained, and that too much water was almost as bad as too little. She learned that pinching off the first few flowers actually made the plant stronger and helped it produce more peppers later in the season. All of this knowledge came from trial and error, from conversations with Hattie and other older women in the community, and from simply paying attention to what the plants seemed to want. She also learned something about nutrition that surprised her. Bell peppers, it turned out, were not just filler food. They were packed with vitamins that her family desperately needed. A single red bell pepper contained more vitamin C than an orange. It had vitamin A, which was good for the eyes. It had vitamin B6, which helped with energy and mood. It had fiber, which kept the stomach feeling full longer. And it had antioxidants, which helped fight off sickness. In a time when many poor families were suffering from malnutrition and related diseases, those peppers were doing more than satisfying hunger. They were keeping people healthy. Dorothy started using the peppers in everything she cooked. She fried them with onions and cornmeal. She stuffed them with rice and bits of whatever meat she could find. She chopped them raw and added them to salads made from wild greens she picked along the roadside. She even learned to roast them over an open flame, peel off the charred skin, and preserve them in jars with a little vinegar and salt. Those jars sat on a shelf in her kitchen like rows of jewels, glowing red and green and gold. And they kept her family fed through the winter months when the plants were dormant and nothing new was growing. The neighbors followed her lead. Alma Turner learned Dorothy's roasting technique and added her own twist, mixing the peppers with garlic and a little sugar. Another woman on the street, a widow named Frances, discovered that dried pepper flakes made from the seeds and inner membranes could be used as seasoning that lasted for months. The women traded recipes and tips the same way they traded seeds, freely and generously, because in those days, nobody had anything to sell, but everybody had something to share. By the spring of 1933, Dorothy's little block in Birmingham had become something remarkable. Nearly every house had some kind of container garden. Peppers were the main crop, but people had also started growing tomatoes, beans, and greens using the same basic methods Dorothy had learned from Hattie. The neighborhood that had once been silent and defeated was now alive with green growing things, and the sound of people talking and laughing and working together. And it had all started with one woman, one pepper, and a handful of seeds that most people would have thrown in the trash. The year 1933 brought new challenges to Dorothy and her neighbors. The winter had been harsh, and several of the container plants that people had tried to keep alive indoors did not survive. The cold crept through the thin walls of their houses and froze the soil in the pots overnight. Dorothy lost 2 of her own plants that winter, and it stung her more than she expected. She had grown attached to those plants, the way a person grows attached to anything they have poured their time and love into. But she still had seeds. Dozens of them, carefully dried and stored in small paper envelopes that she kept in a tin box on top of her kitchen cabinet. And as soon as the frost broke and the first warm days of March arrived, she was back on her porch, pushing seeds into fresh soil and starting the whole cycle over again. This was the real secret that Hattie had passed on to her, and it was the secret that made bell peppers such a powerful survival crop. You did not need to buy anything new each year. You did not need a store or a catalog or a seed company. Every single pepper you grew contained the seeds for the next generation of plants. As long as you saved those seeds and kept them dry and safe, you had an endless supply. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining system that cost nothing but time and attention. And in an era when money had all but disappeared from the daily lives of working people, time and attention were the only currencies that still had value. Dorothy was not the only one who understood this. Across the country, agricultural extension agents and home economists were beginning to spread the word about seed saving and home food production. The government launched what it called the Subsistence Homestead Program, which encouraged families to grow their own food on small plots of land. Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Franklin Roosevelt, became a vocal supporter of home gardening and even had a garden planted on the White House grounds. But the real experts were not in Washington. The real experts were women like Dorothy and Hattie, women who had been growing food out of necessity long before became a national conversation. The practice of saving pepper seeds had deep roots in American history, going back much further than the Depression. Native American communities had been cultivating peppers for thousands of years before European settlers ever arrived on the continent. They understood the life cycle of the plant in ways that would take Western science centuries to catch up with. They knew which peppers produced the strongest seeds. They knew how to cross different varieties to create new ones. They knew that the pepper plant was not just a source of food, but also a source of medicine, using it to treat everything from toothaches to digestive problems. When European settlers began farming in America, they borrowed many of these techniques, often without giving credit to the people who had developed them. By the 1800s, bell peppers were a common crop in American gardens, especially in the southern states, where the long, warm growing season was ideal for them. Families passed seeds down from one generation to the next, and certain varieties became closely associated with specific communities and regions. There were peppers that had been grown by the same family for 50 or 60 years, each generation selecting the biggest and best fruits to save seeds from, gradually improving the variety over time. This was not laboratory science. It was kitchen table science, practiced by ordinary people who understood their plants the way a mother understands her children. But something changed in the early 20th century. Commercial seed companies began to grow and dominate the market. They offered convenience and variety, and many families stopped saving their own seeds and started buying new ones each spring. The old knowledge began to fade. By the time the Depression hit, a whole generation of Americans had lost touch with the basic skill of seed saving. They knew how to buy food, but not how to grow it. They knew how to open a can, but not how to fill one. And when the economy collapsed and the stores ran empty, they found themselves helpless in a way their grandparents never would have been. That is what made women like Dorothy so important. They were the bridge between the old knowledge and the new reality. They took what the previous generation had known and applied it to their own desperate circumstances. And in doing so, They kept alive a tradition that might otherwise have been lost forever. Dorothy's garden continued to expand through the spring and summer of 1933. She had learned from her mistakes the previous year and was now a more confident and skilled grower. She staggered her plantings, putting new seeds in the ground every 2 weeks so that she would have a continuous supply of peppers rather than one big harvest followed by nothing. She learned to identify male and female flowers on the plants and understood that both were needed for fruit to form. She discovered that placing the containers close together actually helped the plants because they shielded each other from wind and created a warmer microclimate around themselves. She also began experimenting with different ways to preserve her harvest for the coming winter. Drying was the simplest method. She sliced the peppers thin and laid them out on screens in the sun until they were crisp and lightweight. Dried peppers could be stored for months in a cool, dry place and rehydrated later by soaking them in water. She also continued her roasting and vinegar preservation method, which gave the peppers a rich, smoky flavor that her children loved. And she tried something new that year, grinding dried peppers into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle borrowed from Hattie. That powder could be sprinkled on anything, beans, rice, bread, eggs, and it turned bland survival food into something that actually tasted good. The nutritional impact of all this homegrown food was visible on the faces of Dorothy's children. Her oldest son, James Jr., who was 12, had been thin and pale for most of the previous year. By the end of that summer, he had color in his cheeks and energy in his step. Her middle child, a daughter named Ruth, stopped complaining of headaches that had plagued her for months. And little Ella, the youngest, who had been small for her age, started growing so fast that Dorothy had to let out the hems on all her dresses twice in one season. The peppers alone did not cause all of this, of course, but they were a major part of a diet that was finally giving these children what their bodies needed to be strong and healthy. The garden had changed more than their bodies, though. It had changed their spirits. The children took pride in helping their mother with the plants. James Jr. carried water from the pump each morning. Ruth helped with the drying and preserving. Even little Ella had her own special job, watching for caterpillars and picking them off the leaves with her tiny fingers. The garden gave the family something to do together, something to care about together, and something to hope for together. And in the middle of the worst economic disaster the country had ever seen, hope was the most valuable crop of all dot by 1934. Dorothy Mae Collins had become something of a local legend in her corner of Birmingham. People came from several blocks away to see her back porch garden and ask for advice. Women she had never met showed up at her door with empty cans and jars, asking for seeds and instructions. A reporter from the local newspaper even came by one afternoon and wrote a small article about her, calling her the Pepper Lady of Birmingham. Dorothy laughed when she read it. She told her children she was no expert. She was just a mother who did not want her family to starve. But the truth was that Dorothy had become an expert, whether she claimed the title or not. 2 full years of growing had taught her things that no book could have taught her. She understood her plants on an intuitive level. She could look at a leaf and know if the plant needed more water or less. She could smell the soil and tell if it was healthy or depleted. She knew the exact moment a pepper was ready to be picked, not by counting days on a calendar, but by the way it felt in her hand, firm and heavy and smooth, with a slight give when she pressed her thumb against the skin. She had also developed a network, not a formal organization, but a loose web of women throughout the neighborhood who traded seeds, shared knowledge, and supported each other through the endless challenges of growing food with almost no resources. Hattie was still the elder of the group, the one everyone turned to when they had a question nobody else could answer. But Dorothy had become the organizer, the one who kept things moving and made sure everyone had what they needed. This network proved its value in the summer of 1934, when a drought hit central Alabama. Weeks went by without rain. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the red clay soil turned hard and cracked. Many of the gardens in the neighborhood withered and died. Plants that had been thriving just weeks before turned brown and collapsed. It was devastating for families who had come to depend on their homegrown food. But Dorothy and her network adapted. They pooled their water resources. Families with wells shared with families who relied on public pumps. They moved containers into shadier spots during the hottest part of the day and brought them back into the sun during the cooler morning hours. They mulched the soil with newspaper and dried leaves to help it retain moisture. And they prioritized. When water was scarce, they focused on keeping the strongest and most productive plants alive rather than trying to save everything. Dorothy lost some plants that summer. Everyone did. But she saved enough to keep producing peppers, and more importantly, she saved enough seeds to start fresh the following year. The drought taught her a lesson she never forgot. The plants were resilient, but they were not invincible. Nature could be generous, but it could also be cruel. The only real security came from saving seeds, because as long as you had seeds, you could always start over. That same year, Dorothy learned something new about bell peppers that expanded her understanding of why they were such a remarkable food. She had always known they tasted good and kept her family healthy. But a woman who worked at the county health office told her something specific. She told Dorothy that bell peppers, especially the red ones, contained a compound that helped the body absorb iron from other foods. This was important because iron deficiency was one of the most common health problems among poor families during the Depression. People were eating beans and greens that contained iron, but their bodies were not absorbing it efficiently. Adding bell peppers to those meals made the iron more available, which meant the same food became more nourishing, simply because of the pepper alongside it. Dorothy started paying closer attention to how she combined foods. She made sure to include peppers in meals that were heavy on beans and dark leafy greens. She told her neighbors to do the same. It was a small change, but it made a real difference. Children who had been listless and tired started showing more energy. Adults who had been getting sick frequently started staying healthier. The pepper was not just a food. It was a tool that made other foods work better inside the body. As the Depression dragged on into its 5th and 6th years, the survival gardens of Birmingham and communities like it across America became more than just a way to get by. They became a way of life. People who had started growing out of desperation discovered that they enjoyed it. There was satisfaction in watching something grow from a tiny seed into a plant that bore fruit. There was pride in feeding your family with something you had created with your own hands. And there was community in sharing the work and the harvest with your neighbors. Dorothy's husband, James, who had been skeptical and withdrawn in the early days, had become one of the most enthusiastic gardeners on the block. He built raised beds out of scrap lumber he found at abandoned construction sites. He designed a simple irrigation system using old pipes and buckets that carried water from a rain barrel to the plants with minimal effort. He even started experimenting with composting, collecting kitchen scraps and leaves and letting them break down into rich, dark soil that made the plants grow faster and stronger than anything Dorothy had seen before. The Collins family garden, which had started with one rusty bucket and a handful of seeds, now covered most of their small backyard. They grew peppers of several varieties, along with tomatoes, squash, beans, and collard greens. They had more food than they could eat, which meant they could share with families who were still struggling. Dorothy made it a point to give away produce every week, just as Hattie had given her those first seeds. She believed that food grown from the earth belonged to everyone, and that hoarding it went against everything the garden had taught her about generosity and community. By the end of 1934, Dorothy estimated that she had distributed seeds to more than 40 families in her area. Each of those families was now growing their own peppers and saving their own seeds to share with others. The chain that Hattie had started with a quiet conversation after church had grown into something much larger that any of them had imagined. It was a living network of food, knowledge, and mutual support, all of it rooted in the simple act of saving seeds from a bell pepper and putting them in the ground. And the most remarkable thing about it was that it cost almost nothing. No special equipment, no expensive supplies, no expert training. Just seeds, soil, water, sunlight, and the willingness to try. In a country that was being brought to its knees by economic collapse, that simplicity was its greatest strength. The Depression did not last forever. By the late 1930s, the American economy was slowly beginning to recover. Factories reopened. Jobs came back. Men who had spent years sitting idle went back to work, and families who had been surviving on homegrown food and charity began to have money in their pockets again. In many neighborhoods, the survival gardens that had kept people alive were quietly abandoned. People moved on to store-bought food, canned goods, and the convenience of a paycheck. The tin cans and wooden crates were tossed out. The seed envelopes were forgotten in the backs of drawers. And the knowledge that had been so precious just a few years before started to fade once more. But not in Dorothy Mae Collins's house. Dorothy kept growing. Even after James found steady work again at a new factory that opened in Birmingham in 1938, even after the family had enough money to buy groceries every week, Dorothy refused to give up her garden. Her children sometimes teased her about it. James Jr., now a teenager, asked her why she still spent so much time in the dirt when they could just go to the store like everybody else. Dorothy would look at him with those steady brown eyes of hers and say the same thing every time. She would tell him that the store could close, the factory could close, the banks could fail again. But as long as they had seeds and soil, they would never go hungry. She was right to be cautious. Just a few years later, the United States entered the Second World War, and suddenly the country faced a whole new set of food challenges. With millions of men overseas and much of the nation's agricultural output being directed to feed the military, civilians were once again asked to grow their own food. The government launched the Victory Garden campaign, urging every American household to plant a garden and reduce the strain on the national food supply. For Dorothy, it was not a new idea. It was the same thing she had been doing for a decade. But now the whole country was joining in. Millions of Victory Gardens sprang up across America, in backyards and vacant lots, and public parks and schoolyards. And many of the techniques that these new gardeners used, saving seeds, growing in containers, preserving the harvest, staggering plantings for continuous production, were the very same techniques that Dorothy and women like her had perfected during the hardest years of the Depression. Dorothy volunteered with the local Victory Garden Committee, teaching classes to women who were growing food for the first time. She handed out seeds from her own collection. She walked new gardeners through every step, from drying the seeds to preparing the soil to knowing when to water and when to wait. And of course, bell peppers were always at the center of her lessons. She told every new student the same thing she had learned from Hattie years ago. Start with one pepper. Save the seeds. Plant them carefully. And you will never need to buy another one as long as you live. The war ended in 1945, and once again, the gardens faded. The prosperity of the post-war years made home food production seem unnecessary. Supermarkets expanded. Processed food became cheap and convenient. Suburban homes were built with green lawns instead of vegetable gardens. And the old knowledge, the grandmother knowledge, the survival knowledge, was pushed aside by a culture that valued speed and convenience above all else. Dorothy grew older. Her children grew up and moved away. James Jr. became an engineer in Atlanta. Ruth married a schoolteacher and moved to Nashville. Ella, the youngest, went to nursing school in Memphis. Dorothy was proud of all of them. She knew that the garden had played a part in making them who they were, not just by feeding their bodies, but by teaching them patience, resilience, and the value of working with their hands. Dorothy continued to grow peppers in her backyard until she was well into her 70s. She still saved seeds every year. She still gave them away to anyone who asked. And she still told the story of how it all started. An old woman named Hattie, a conversation after church, and one bell pepper that changed everything. Hattie had passed away in 1941, but Dorothy kept her memory alive through the seeds. In a very real sense, every pepper that grew in Dorothy's garden carried a piece of Hattie in it. The genetics of those original plants, shaped by generations of careful seed saving, were a living link to the past. When Dorothy handed a packet of seeds to a young neighbor in 1965, she was passing along the same biological heritage that Hattie had given her more than 30 years earlier. The seeds did not know about economics or wars or hard times. They only knew how to grow. Dorothy Mae Collins passed away in 1978 at the age of 80. Her daughter Ella, who had returned to Birmingham to care for her in her final years, found the tin box on top of the kitchen cabinet. Inside were dozens of small paper envelopes, each one carefully labeled in Dorothy's handwriting. Pepper seeds, sorted by variety and year. Some of those envelopes dated back to the early 1930s. Ella kept every single one of them. Today, nearly a century after Dorothy planted her first seeds in a rusty tin bucket, the practice she helped keep alive is experiencing a revival. A new generation of Americans, concerned about food prices, supply chain disruptions, and the environmental impact of industrial agriculture, is turning back to the same simple idea that sustained families through the Depression and the war. They are learning to save seeds. They are growing bell peppers in pots on apartment balconies and in raised beds in suburban backyards. They are discovering what Dorothy and Hattie and millions of unnamed women before them always knew, that the most powerful thing you can do in uncertain times is put a seed in the ground and trust it to grow. The bell pepper asks for so little: a handful of soil, a little water, some sunlight and patience. In return, it gives you food, nutrition, medicine, flavor, and most importantly, it gives you more seeds. Always more seeds. That is the deal the pepper plant has been offering human beings for thousands of years. And every time we are smart enough to accept it, it keeps its promise. Plant once and harvest again and again and again. It is not truly infinite, but it is close enough to feel like a miracle. And in hard times, a miracle is exactly what people need.